We had been 3 weeks in Moscow, and since the battle, the Emperor had not mentioned to me the loss of my brother, although he had been most honorably mentioned in the bulletin. "What can I do for your brother's aides de camp?" were his first words about a loss which had been very painful to me. "They must be fine officers, for their general was a splendid man. He would have gone far." I answered His Majesty that, when he would permit me, I would present several proposals for the promotion and reward for them, and for all the officers of my brother's staff, as well as his orderly officers, for whom nothing had been done. "Let me have it today," was the Emperor's reply. His silence about my brother arose solely from his irritation with me, for he spoke well of him to the Prince of Neuchâtel and to Duroc. On the evening of the battle, he had said to the Prince of Neuchâtel, speaking of my brother, "He was my best cavalry officer. He had a quick eye and he was brave. By the end of the campaign, he would have replaced Murat." The Emperor granted all the promotions I suggested to him, particularly those for my brother's aides, but he never spoke another word to me about him. All the reports that reached the Emperor were grave. Everything was done to make him sense the difficulty of his position. But the greater the difficulties, the more determined he was to overcome them. For the most part, the corps had reserve of supplies, but the services which a proper administration ought to supply were gravely menaced, there being neither soldiers nor transports to bring them up. The Emperor had thought that here, as in other campaigns, he would meet with concerns, which for gold, or preferably paper, would deliver what was required. But where there was no proper administration, there could be no contractors. Undaunted by difficulties, and as usual, always seeking to evade what he could not surmount, he thought it would be practicable to make use of the most destitute refugees, for he imagined that the Cossacks, who were harassing our own lines of supply, would take pity on their compatriots, and thus supply their needs and part of what we ourselves wanted. He therefore ordered the formation of a Russian company to go out into the villages to purchase food, but no one dared to volunteer for it, although they were promised payment in ready cash, for they knew perfectly well that the Cossacks would treat the inhabitants of Moscow no better than they treated its garrison. On October 2nd or 3rd, the Emperor, who had not discussed affairs with me for a long time, asked me whether I thought that the Tsar would be disposed to make peace if overtures were made to him. He did not tell me of those which he had already attempted. I answered frankly that it seemed to me that the sacrifice of Moscow argued a disposition far from pacific, that the more the season advanced, the greater were the chances in favor of Russia. In a word, that it was scarcely probable that the Tsar would have set fire to his capital with the object of signing a peace among the ruins. "Would you go to Petersburg?" the Emperor asked me. "You will see Tsar Alexander. I shall entrust you with a letter, and you will make peace." I answered that it would be useless to send me on such a mission, as I should not be received. Assuming a jocular and kindly air, the Emperor told me that I did not know what I was saying, for the Tsar would be all the more eager to profit by the opportunity given him to enter into negotiations, inasmuch as his nobles, already ruined by the war and the burning of Moscow, were anxious for peace. He was certain of it. That fire, he added, was the sort of folly of which a madman might boast when he kindled the flame, but which he would repent next day. The Tsar Alexander sees quite well that his generals are incapable, that the best of troops can do nothing under such leadership. He continued to press me with arguments to convince me of what he said and to induce me to accept this mission. In vain did I repeat all of the objections I have mentioned above. The Emperor replied that I was mistaken. He had just heard from Petersburg that they were packing up in the utmost hurry, that the most valuable effects had already been sent into the interior and even to England. The Tsar was laboring under no further illusions, for he saw his army diminished and disheartened, while the French army was all ready to march on Petersburg. The season was still favorable, he added, His Majesty, but by such a march the Russian Empire would be lost, for a defeat would gravely embarrass the Tsar. He would therefore seize with eagerness any overture made by us, as it would furnish him with an honorable way of getting out of the unfortunate position in which he was placed. Finding that he was unable to shake my resolution, the emperor added that beginning with myself, everyone who had been in Russia had told him fairy tales about the climate. He then insisted anew on his proposals. The emperor thought that perhaps my distaste came only from such embarrassment as I might feel about going, at a moment when Russia was being thus ravaged, to Petersburg, where I had been so well treated. And he said, very well, just to Marshal Kutuzov's headquarters. I repeat that either attempt would be equally unsuccessful, and added that I recalled what the Tsar Alexander had said to me on another occasion, and that I knew his character and was refusing this mission because I was certain he would never sign a peace in his capital. As this overture of ours, I concluded, could achieve nothing, it was advisable to not make it. The emperor turned on his heel, abruptly saying, very well, I shall send Lauriston. He shall have the honor of making peace and saving your friend Alexander's crown for him. Shortly afterward, indeed, the emperor entrusted Monsieur Lauriston with this mission. Lauriston presented himself at the Russian field headquarters on the 4th and 5th and was handsomely received. Kutuzov had refused to let him proceed, but it seemed to him that everyone was anxious to put an end to this struggle, of which the Russians appeared even more weary than we were. It was said that a reply would shortly be received from Petersburg, and this delighted the emperor, who hoped and desired a suspension of hostilities while terms were being made. He supposed that, as was customary in similar circumstances, there would be nothing to do but settle the lines each side was to preserve while the negotiations were going forward. From what the Prince of Neuchâtel and Duroc told me, the emperor attributed the silence of the Russians regarding the overtures made at Smolensk, and since our arrival in Moscow, to the conviction held by them since the return of Balashov from Vilna, that His Majesty would consider no arrangement that did not have the restoration of Poland on some scale at its basis. The emperor began to think, however, that the course of events and the burning of the countryside had turned their heads, and that the destruction of Moscow had, for the time being at least, carried them away with enthusiasm. He even doubted whether they would receive this plenipotentiary, and on the night before Lauriston's departure, he wrote to the King of Naples, telling him to announce to the Russians that one of the imperial aides-de-camp was being sent, and to make sure in advance that he would be received. At heart, he still flattered himself that negotiations would be open. At least he said so, and he must be believed, since he stayed in Moscow in spite of his overtures remaining unanswered, and although the lapse of time since his first endeavors and his reason itself must have cried aloud that Alexander had no wish to treat, nonetheless he stubbornly set to work on fresh approaches. Like everyone else, the emperor must have realized that the repeated messages indicative of his embarrassment might only confirm the enemy in their hostile intentions. Yet he went on sending them. For a man of such fine political sense, of such careful calculation, how blind must have been his faith, his confidence in his star. What blindness or feebleness he must have attributed to his foes. With his eagle eye and his preeminent judgment, how could he have entertained illusions on such a point? I leave these reflections to observers of human nature, for such opposites in so great a character, this tendency of the heart to believe what it most desires, even in the face of all improbabilities, would be a great reproach in a man of the emperor's exalted judgment. Were not this strange contradiction a part of our nature, and were not this hope a man's last consolation in adversity? The King of Naples, despite all orders to the contrary, continued to treat with the enemy. The Cossacks were accustomed to notice him on account of his singular uniform, and seeing him the bravest man in the midst of his gallant skirmishers, they always refrained from shooting in his direction. Their officers came to compliment him, assuring him as before that so highly did they admire his bravery that they were resolved to never fire on him, but to content themselves with making him prisoner. One day, however, a Cossack, who had evidently been imperfectly coached in this new system advanced guard politics, fired a pistol almost point blank at him, while His Majesty was chattering and strolling about. Happily, he was not hit. Instantly, an officer came up to offer excuses and to assure His Majesty that this disloyal enemy would be punished. One good resulted from this incident. The king lost something of his confidence and was less inclined to believe in the pacific dispositions of these gentry.